Hello, I'm Dan Moyane. Welcome to hashtag Connect Africa Moyane, where we seek to enrich people's minds by sharing African experiences and stories that hopefully can contribute to a transforming continent. Milton, you are now the head of BBC Bureau in Africa. Of course, leading up to that, you were the deputy head. And you've been covering all kinds of stories, not just in South Africa, but in other parts of the continent. You traveled quite a bit. At that time, if you look back, what were the highlights for you as you were moving around Africa and doing this and marshalling the BBC coverage resources?
It's always difficult to answer that question because I can't even answer it myself in my own head then. But some things do stand out. The release of Nelson Mandela.
Biggest story, eh?
Big.
Of the time.
27 years in prison. He gets released. And the whole history that unfolds following that. 11 February 1990, 3 p.m. And then so many other powerful moments in coverage. The fall of Mobutu Sese Seko. I was in Zaire before the country changed its name to the Democratic Republic of Congo with Laurent Kabila. We were covering Mobutu Sese Seko then, and the rebellion that began in the east, in Goma and Kisangani, and it moved all across the Congo to Kinshasa in May of 1997. So that was a big moment. And also being in Sierra Leone, covering the Fode Sanko butchery, chopping people's limbs with the RUF, the Revolutionary United Front. And also spending time in Nigeria, the return of Olusegun Obasanjo into the presidency was quite special. I drove all across Nigeria from Kano all the way past Zuma Rock, Kaduna State into FCT or Abuja, and many other areas. The Mozambican floods in 2000 when baby Rosita Pedro was born in the tree. Very powerful moments of our coverage. Nelson Mandela becoming president of South Africa, having been in prison and telling his jailers, let bygones be bygones.
What would have had impact for you? What was more impactful for you around the continent? I mean, from the time you were involved as an interpreter for the BBC in the late 80s, right up to when you were running the whole BBC news operation.
So the impact is learning about human behavior.
Tell me.
That we are all born for goodness, all of us. But the ugliness that comes out of us is shocking. So I just told you about the RUF and Fode Sanko. You know, when Charles Taylor was fighting in Liberia and they had young child soldiers, and one guy we met outside Mamba Point in Monrovia called himself Colonel Bombblast, and he was no older than 12. And the guy had power. He would marshal big people and move them into positions. And you just think this is terrible. So you always remember that when you've seen the terrible sight of war, you remember that there is so much goodness that comes out of it at the same time. There are people who sacrifice their lives. And that's what I learned, not just in the countries I mentioned, in Angola, in Rwanda, in Sudan. You know, I spent time in South Sudan before the country broke into two, around Juba. It was just, and I spent a little bit of time in Darfur, in the west of Sudan. You know, Darfur is the size of France. and it's got a city called El Janina, which is the regional capital. I think, and I stand to be corrected, maybe the YouTubers will find me a Google search there. What's the furthest place from the sea in Africa? I think it's El Janina. But that stuff teaches you so much about humanity. The Janjaweed, you know, the guys who come on horseback and torch villages, rape, maim, you know, Eastern Congo. So that has taught me to take away from all that strife. You know, I'm talking about really bad things, terrible things. But I see the goodness of humanity rising from those. And it's happening very gradually, but ever so more positively. We're moving forward instead of going backward.
The big networks like the BBC, they seem to cover Africa from that perspective of the ugliness that you've just described. I was a BBC correspondent myself when I was in Mozambique from 1985 to 91. Each time I would get a call from Focus on Africa to wanting a story to be, there's been an attack, there's been some destruction. There could have been a big story that day where President Samora Machel announced the biggest harvest of the year after a drought or something. I'm just using an example.
Yeah.
It would not, yes, it's important, but no, we want to talk about the death and the destruction. Yeah. When you were heading the Bureau of BBC in Africa, did you come into a struggle where you could say, guys, there are other stories we can focus on?
Yeah. You know, that question is so relevant. It's not funny. So one of the things I did when I was head of BBC, I introduced, so number one, I also, like you, wanted to cover the good harvest stories. You know, so many other good stories are happening. And one of the things I used to find, you know, my wife is a super specialist. She's very highly qualified doctor, brain doctor, neuro. And I always used to say to myself, but why can't I see people like her on BBC? You know, I always see the lady running to a UNHCR camp or to a WFP food supply point with flies and dying children and Ebola. And, you know, I went to Angola to cover the Marburg virus. It's a very bad virus, a bit like what we're experiencing now. It's airborne, and you know, it's you kind of, you need to be careful where you touch. You're washing your hands all the time. It's just incredible. Can't shake people's hands, and I was always wondering, we cover so much of the bad of Africa, and but we never see people like some of our friends, and I know our mutual friends who are doing interesting things. They are not in war. They are not wearing camouflage fatigues with mirrored sunglasses, with AK, raping, pillaging, banning, killing. You know, why can't we show them? And I realized that the news is the news. So you can't come with a feature of what we call a soft story on the news. There's not enough time on TV. The news is from 0:00 to about 24 if you take the weather, sport, and the little breaks, right? That's how you break up the clock. And you need to come up with something else. So we started with the back half-hour programs, the business programs, where we could showcase these stories that I also, like you, much like you, wanted to showcase. So I went to present a case in London, and they accepted my argument, and they gave me a budget, and we started a program called Africa Direct. At that time, the BBC had Europe Direct, they had the USA Direct, and Asia Today, and other very nice back half hour programs, which were showing all the soft, the art, the culture, the food, the literature, the music, you know, way of life, business. And now we have so many of those programs that have now sort of morphed into more business friendly.
So it's become more accepted
it's
now
more
that
accepted.
There are other stories
Exactly.
about the continent.
That you can cover the continent a lot more better than just death and destruction.
And when you look at today, we're sitting here in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. Is Africa, in your eyes, from when you're watching and you're listening, you're observing, being given its rightful coverage space in terms of telling its stories? I mean, we have brilliant scientists on this continent who are doing marvelous things. Some of them work for this big international, multinational pharmaceutical company.
So you see, the other thing that you notice when you are in the hot spot, you realize that people only remember there's something called collective amnesia. So we have a lot of people who forget certain big things at the same time, but they don't forget other things that happened around the same time. So for instance, I know that we cover a lot more good stories on BBC, or we used to when I was there, and I can see they still do cover. And even then, we covered the good stories. But people will remember the bad ones, okay? So the one thing that we always have to remember, even today, that very few stories get on international media without having crossed the local news desks. So the stories that people get angry about when they see them on BBC and CNN and Al Jazeera, why is the world covering Africa negatively? Well, they started with local newspapers. And they went to local radio, they went to local TV before they get to international. The anger comes when they are now at international. But people forget that the international news crews found those stories from the local news organization.
Is there a problem with our storytelling or choice of stories that we tell?
Well, now there's no problem because everybody can tell their own story via social media. The internet has opened up the world. You can sit in your room and tell your own story, like much what you're doing now. You are telling your own African story through this medium, through this format, and everybody can do it. The problem is there's a colonial lingering hangover where people are always looking for the colonial context. And I think that there is a colonial context, but it does not exist everywhere. There are things where we should take responsibility for ourselves as Africans without including an appraisal requirement from our colonial oppressors.
So into the future, that's one aspect you'd want to see being different, that we don't apply this colonial contextual lens to everything that we are reading and seeing and doing, or storytelling is telling about. We need to own our stories in the right way and take responsibility for it. What else would you like to see differently?
So Africa needs to tell its own stories. But Africa is not a country. So do not expect to hear stories about Africa as if you're talking about one country. Africa is a combination of about 54 countries, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, well, the Western Sahara is still disputed with the Polisario Front.
And therefore, you need to expect 54 different stories from Africa. But one of the things that Africans can do collectively is to set up a pan-African television, 24-hour television station, a bit like a CNN for Africa, an Al Jazeera for Africa, a BBC for Africa, so that Africans can be in charge of their own story. So they cannot blame some British guy who came, or German, or Belgian, or American. They themselves can go to Malawi and cover the election in Malawi. They can go to Tanzania. They can go everywhere. They can go to Cameroon and cover Cameroon the way they would like Cameroon to be covered. But the important thing is that there should be no holy cows. We cannot go and gloss over some of our ugly behaviors because we are trying to make Africa look good. That is what you call window dressing. And it will actually come back to bite us because it won't be the truth that is required to share about your own stories.
Finally, Milton, knowing what you know along this journey that you've had, this illustrious journey of yours, from a young person in Soweto to ending up running the whole of BBC in Africa, and today doing the wonderful many things that you're doing, what would you tell your 15-year-old self way back in Orlando West today about things that matter for you. If you could choose 5 things that you think today, knowing what you know, looking back now at your 15 years, because you had your dreams, you had your issues, now you're looking back, what would you advise them? 5 things.
So, you know, when Barack Obama came here to deliver the Nelson Mandela lecture a few years ago, he said something, he said so many things. And as an orator, he's eloquent and, you know. But one thing stuck in my mind. He said something like, old truths don't die, okay, or don't lie. So old truths remain. So in all this changing world that you've got to be up with the Twitter and the Instagram, the fundamental truths are still relevant and they are still as strong as they were then. So this is what I learned when I grew up. I was an altar boy in the Holy Cross Church in Orlando West. When I grew up, I was an altar boy for 7 years, I think. And I learned about hard work, discipline, education, respect, humility, and outward perspective, you know, looking outwards, not being too inward looking. Sometimes I find some of our people, and this is more about social media as well. It's not just South Africa. You know, people are too much inward looking. You know, everybody else is the other. They came to steal our jobs. You know, that mentality is a killer for me. You must always embrace international solidarity, because at the end of the day, we are all one humanity. And I saw this in Iraq. I spent a lot of time in Iraq, in Baghdad and Basra. And when the Americans were bombing that country, we spoke to Tariq Aziz. He was one of Saddam Hussein's deputy prime ministers, I think. And at one point, he was the ambassador to the UN for Iraq. And just before the bombing, he said, you know, the Americans can come. They can come and bomb buildings, bridges, and dams of Iraq, but they will never bomb the spirit of the people of Iraq. And I learned from that, you know, the oppressor can come and beat us in Soweto or beat you in Nigeria, in Maiduguri. Look at what's happening with Boko Haram there. Look at what Al-Shabaab is doing in East Africa. But they will never bomb the spirit of the people of Kenya, the spirit of the people of northeastern Nigeria, because we are all human. And that is where we come back to Ubuntu. So when I'm 15, speaking to my young self now, embrace Ubuntu. I am me because you are you. I cannot be fully me until you are fully you. You and me are connected.
Milton, brother.
Thank you very much,
No,
Dan.
thank you very much.
Yes, it
was a
good
pleasure
to talk to you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. You're
Much
welcome.
appreciated.
Thank you.